welcome to this event entitled Large Grant-Funded Research Centers, Promises, Pitfalls, and Power Asymmetries. This event is organized by the Development Studies Association, members of council co-leading the Decolonizing Development Subgroup. Members of the Decolonizing Development Subgroup include Professor Indrajit Roy, who is a professor of global development politics at the University of York, and Professor Peter Taylor, who is a professor and research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, Sussex. My name is Eyob Balcha Gebremariam. I will be chairing and moderating this event. I'm a member of the DSA Council, as I said, and I'm also a research affiliate at King's College London International Development Department. My primary area of work is on the area of political economic development, the politics of academic knowledge production, and transformative research collaborations. So we live in a world of multiple and overlapping inequities and inequalities, social, economic, and political, and epistemic inequalities and inequities, to mention few. Today's event focuses on the sphere of academic knowledge production in our field, development studies broadly defined. The ecosystem of academic knowledge production in development studies has contributed significantly in shaping transformative debates, policy initiatives, and programs at various levels to affect people's lives for the better. Various global policies, namely the MDGs, the SDGs, and other specific frameworks, have been shaped by academic knowledge produced in our field. But this field and ecosystem is not a perfect one. It has a colonial history that evolved in the present in different shape or form. There are also various aspects of challenge linked with the dominance of a particular epistemic orientation, mainly Eurocentric perspective, methodological practices, and the sidelining of views and perspectives of societies of the global majority world. In today's session, we specifically focus on large grant-funded research centers, especially in the UK. Our discussion is informed by a paper published on the Journal of Development Studies in early 2025, entitled Large Grant-Funded Research Centers and Concept Generation in Development Research, authored by Dr. Portia Roelofs. We have the author, Dr. Portia Roelofs, with us. I will briefly introduce her from her profile on her official profile page and ask her to give us a brief presentation. Dr. Roelofs is a lecturer in politics in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. She has degrees from Oxford, SOAS, and LSE. She has held postdoctoral fellowship at the LSE and St. Anne's College, Oxford. She has been a visiting researcher at the Universities of Maiduguri and Ibadan, Nigeria. She sits on the editorial board of the African Arguments book series. Dr. Roelofs has served on the Council of the African Studies Association UK and as a co-convener of the Political Studies Association Special Group on Global Development Politics. She's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy and also co-convener of a research group at King's College called Global South Research Group. So I will give our presenter, Dr. Portia, 5 minutes just to briefly summarize her paper, the rationale, the findings, and the core argument that she puts forward. This will be followed by 2 separate questions from my side to expand and go deeper into some of the claims that she's making. And after her response, I will open the floor for questions, comments, and discussion among the participants. Dr. Portia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Eyob. And also thank you to the DSA for very kindly arranging this forum and all of the work that went into kind of making it happen. And also to the audience for giving us a bit of their time today. And we're really looking forward to kind of Q&A and discussion a bit later. So yeah, as Eyob introduced, so I published this paper that came out in Journal of Development Studies in 2025, and it was really inspired in the first instance by this kind of long tradition of work critiquing the coloniality of knowledge production systems. So thinking of key people like Mahmoud Mandami and Pauline Hutonji, and then kind of brought to life more recently by people like Robtel Paley and Eyob in your own work, that points to these kind of enduring hierarchies and assumptions and inequities in the global production of kind of knowledge, in which Africa and then the broader global South are continuously positioned as subordinate. And I think then the kind of point of entry for me was thinking about how these are enduring injustices and enduring inequities, and yet they're always contingently reproduced in different configurations and different forms, depending on the kind of specific institutional framework or set of incentives currently operating in academia and knowledge production. And this is because actually academia is a site of kind of constant institutional churn and regeneration, and there are new ideas that shape it either politically or internally, or new scientific paradigms. And so some of the ways in which that was critiqued in kind of earlier eras, so thinking of things like the Tamalian Oloka Onyango Bitches in the Academy paper from 1997, which I very much recommend, and I cite in the paper, they're talking about how do these inequities play out in a largely donor-funded African research landscape in the 1990s in the wake of structural adjustment policies. And then updating that over the last kind of few decades, there have been different iterations of looking at how this kind of injustice plays out, either in journals and editorial boards, or the structures of data collection, or the way that conferences are organized. And into this kind of literature, I started to feel like there was something missing in that a really key node structuring how academic knowledge production was taking place in the UK, and then by consequence kind of everywhere else, because of its kind of primary position, was something that I then called large grant-funded research centres. And that's this idea that often nowadays, when research money is won, especially when it's won by senior people or in ways that are kind of like influential for the field, it kind of creates its own little organizational bubble, or what I call in the paper kind of proto-bureaucracies, which to some extent stand outside of other bureaucratic forms. So it's not just putting money in the pocket of certain researchers or pre-existing centers or university departments, it's creating a kind of new entity. And then in my personal experience through my PhD and postdoc, I kind of noticed that this was really shaping my colleagues and friends' experience of the academy, but it was also kind of structuring how it is that our other aspirations around decolonizing knowledge, or promoting access and inclusion, or opening up the kind of conceptual horizons which we might use to discuss Africa and African politics. Large grant-funded research centers seem to have a key role in all of these things. And maybe for many of the people listening to this, something else I said in the paper is that at any one time, probably everyone reading and listening is either working for a large grant-funded research center or applying to try and set one up. Like the vast majority of people are in some way tied into this sort of structure. So I thought what I'll do is I'll give a kind of really headline summary of my kind of argumentation of the way that large grant-funded research centers structure knowledge production. Then I'll talk a little bit about the kind of specific shape this takes in terms of development studies at the time I'm looking at, and then I can give you a really brief case study of how this plays out. So broadly speaking, when we're thinking about large grant-funded research centers, the kind of key structure is that they're led by a PI, so a principal investigator, or maybe two co-PIs or three co-PIs. And then they tend to oversee a kind of pyramid shape organization where there are maybe a handful more co-investigators and then quite a large kind of pool at the bottom of more junior researchers. And the kind of unique thing, or the kind of different thing I would say about LGRCs, if you don't mind me using an acronym, and other institutional settings like the university department, is that you get an overlap of managerial control. So who's making hiring decisions, who's making decisions about allocations of money and resources, and intellectual leadership. So typically in a university department, at least in my kind of experience in the UK, like that is not what a head of department is doing. They're not setting the precise research agenda and the terminology in which research must be conducted. And yet there is this overlap of roles. So that's one new thing about it, this kind of pyramidal structure. Another thing is it just puts a lot of money behind the research agenda of those PIs. So the cases I look at from 2016 are in the region of 5 million and 6 million pounds, which at the time was quite a lot of money. There are now large grant-funded research centres, and I'm speaking specifically about kind of politics and development studies. Ones in medicine is a whole other ballgame. But with things like the African Cities Research Consortium, you get pots of money that are like 30 million pounds in one go, which are suddenly being managed by academics who have this kind of intellectual leadership role as well. And again, this is quite different from the way that resources would otherwise have been kind of rallied under the previous system of the block grant or kind of via other means. And then the kind of final step, I guess, is what does this mean for concept generation? So something I then also identified is that you typically see some form of conceptual lock-in at the stage of grant application, where you're applying for money and you're often applying for it with some sort of kind of theoretical claim or typology or set of key conceptual words. And there's some degree of lock-in at grant application stage because you're having to make really, really massive claims in your grant application because grant funding is becoming more competitive. There are political motivations at the level of government to say that British research is world leading. And so people need to be applying in terms that spell out how it's going to be world leading. Demands for value for money are increasingly asking researchers to kind of guarantee that there's going to be real world impact and policy relevance. And all of this needs to, for the kind of due diligence and risk management, all of this almost needs to be guaranteed before the research is done. So there's this kind of ex ante lock-in of promising impact through a certain conceptual framework. And then what this means in terms of kind of autonomy and hierarchies in terms of knowledge production is there are a lot of incentives that don't always play out, but there is a strong kind of leaning then towards the PI picking some concepts and everyone else who's working for the large grant-funded research centre to some extent picking up or using or taking forward those concepts. And so this is especially relevant for us in kind of colonized disciplines like development studies, where we're really concerned about things like what Pauline Hutonji calls the North's monopoly on theory. So we're already keen to think about how can we kind of destabilize the way that theoretical leadership and conceptual leadership is held in these positions of power. And I think unintentionally, large grant-funded research centres sort of reinforce this by locking in certain concepts. And then very briefly to think about how is this sort of exaggerated or came into being at a certain moment in the history of development spending in particular. So broadly speaking, in the 2010s, British public funding for higher education went down very rapidly with the kind of post-financial crash austerity. And there was a shift to relying on student fees. And another way of supplementing income was relying on grant-based income that kind of academics would win from research councils, and then the university would get some portion of that just for their overheads. So there starts to be a real culture of kind of grant capture, where it becomes very, very important for universities at kind of strategic and managerial level to win these grants. And then also there's a kind of a short-lived boom in development aid funding in the UK. So aid funding is ring-fenced at 0.7% of GDP until 2021, where it kind of that's abandoned and it crashes. But there's this period of time where aid funding is ring-fenced in a way that other public spending is not. And quite a lot of that gets channeled into development research. So you've got a kind of unusual moment in the evolution of development research funding, where there's quite a lot of money available to study things that weren't huge topics in the past. So fragile states, parts of the world that typically were sort of beyond the scope of kind of interest. So places like Northern Uganda and South Sudan and DRC Congo. And then so the specific case study I look at is kind of coming into this context. And so I'm just getting up my notes in this one. So in 2016, 2017, when I'm at LSE, there are two big awards for very influential development research programs called CPAID, Centre for Public Authority and International Development, and CRP, Conflict Research Programs, funded respectively by the Global Challenges Research Fund and also by Department for International Development. And in many ways, especially, and on many ways in terms of our kind of decolonizing agenda and interests, these centres are really, really successful. So they bring in a lot of Global South scholars who wouldn't otherwise be working in Northern institutions, wouldn't otherwise have access to resources. They support people doing long-term fieldwork in kind of understudied regions. So there's a lot that they're doing really well. However, there are also some unintended consequences, I argue, around concept generation. So very similar to that model I set out at the beginning, you have a very kind of pyramidal shaped organization. So taking CRP in particular, CPAID, one principal investigator, 6 co-investigators, and 33 more junior researchers. And because of the way that kind of inequalities play out in a lot of higher education, as Eyob has described, kind of Global South and BAME representation is much higher in that kind of lowest rung, the 33 most junior researchers. And then in particular, I look at how do ideas flow through the CRP, so the other research centre. And I look at this one concept that the principal investigator of that research centre coined in his own work, which is called the political marketplace, which is essentially a claim that politics in certain African countries or certain countries can be modelled as a kind of marketplace, and what matters is money and violence, and that's sort of how you should analyse politics. So it's not a crazy claim, but it's a contested one. There are other people who say that money and violence aren't such strong explanatory kind of concepts. And so I look at, in particular, one round of research papers where there are 6 papers covering Somalia, Horn of Africa, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, then there's a kind of general synthesis paper. And I ask, so how many times does it use this concept, this word political marketplace? And this is across, there end up being the PI and 20 other researchers are authoring this set of papers. So how often do they use this term coined by the PI? And I find they use it 205 times. And then I ask, okay, so are they using it in a way that would allow us to tell if they're really identifying the same phenomena? So where you're saying, oh, country X, the DRC operates as a political marketplace, are we saying it's doing the same thing as if we say, oh, Iraq operates as a political marketplace? And so the criteria I set for that is, are they quoting a definition, so we know that it's the same, and then are they citing back using page references to where that definition comes from? So can you actually trace that this concept's being used in the same way? And so across the 6 papers and 205 citations, I find that there's only one direct reference to an original definition, and this doesn't have a page reference. So what that suggests is that concepts are being used, but they're not being used with the same degree of rigor as we would see in sort of standard peer-reviewed academic work. That, depending on what you think the purpose of sort of in like this sort of policy facing research publication is, for some people that's not a problem, because the aim is to try and get research out there as quickly as possible. But I think there are some things we should be concerned about in this, because first of all, it shows that there's what could be called a kind of faux popularization, and I'll wrap this up in a couple of minutes. There could be what's called a kind of faux popularization going on. So normally in academia, someone suggests a concept. They say, I think what's going on in these countries could be described as political marketplace. And then other scholars who are not so in a kind of subordinate position to that scholar would look at it and kind of use their own judgment and do their own research. And they'd either pick up this phrase and say, yeah, I think that describes what we're seeing. Or they'd say, no, it doesn't. Something else describes it better, or it doesn't quite fit the definition or whatever. And yet here we're seeing a kind of real uptake of this term in a way that doesn't necessarily have that same kind of rigorous underpinning. So I'll kind of leave it there. That's the kind of core of the case study I look at. But the overall argument is that none of this is this is all about unintended consequences, where smart people who cared about research funding for development sat down and tried to come up with structures and institutions and incentives. And there was nothing necessarily wrong with these, but they played out in ways that were kind of end up reproducing inequalities and end up being subject to academic incentives that are maybe somewhat perverse. And they have the consequence of, I think, reinforcing and doubling down on a lot of the academic hierarchies that we're otherwise critiquing. So that's how I think these kind of big structural issues are playing out in this quite specific institutional context. But I'll hand back to Eyob.
Exactly. Thank you, Portia. I think what I want to hear more, and for us especially, the participants to focus on more, is what you've said at the later end of your summary. That is to focus on the structural and systemic issues that have enabled, that have created the fertile ground for such kind of academic knowledge production to flourish, to become a possibility. In doing so, I think it's very important also to make a link between our efforts and practice of pursuing, equity, justice within academia, and also national level politics, political economy, because the ways that research funding has been restructured within the UK has played a role with this regard, and also the incentives that have been provided for knowledge production processes. More, and also the role that the impact agenda puts, the pressures that it puts for the kinds of outputs, the way that certain claims are formulated and shaped. So I think, yes, probably some of these impacts that you have observed can be unintended. However, what has made this unintended abnormality, for instance, to be something that's quite common is, I think, something that we need to dig deeper so that we question the systemic issues that have enabled these kinds of processes. So we can identify the systemic features, the organizational features, the hierarchical relationships, and to what extent these two also then contribute to the way that the scholarly engagement, the intellectual agenda is pursued. So I will give you just very strictly 3 minutes to make this link between the systemic issues, the organizational arrangement, that's the hierarchy, the impact focus, and the grey literature focused outputs, and to what extent the interplay between the two affect the quality of academic rigor and concept generation, as you said, for instance.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks so much, and for those kind of reflections as well. So I think one thing to kind of point to is there was this idea. So yeah, you've got a kind of structural and systemic kind of influences, but there's always a choice in terms of how they're then instantiated and how institutions are designed. So one of the kind of systemic things was, in this period of time I'm looking at, DFID had a lot of money to get out the door, and it had very little and declining staff capacity to engage in any sort of its own internal quality assurance around that money. So it was trying to find ways of outsourcing quality assurance. And I guess like a plausible suggestion was, well, why don't we give this money in bigger and bigger chunks to senior academics who've proven their worth, who've proven their kind of academic record, and maybe they can kind of do this quality assurance, so that we because we can't. But I think that does miss some things that, in academia, you are rewarded for people citing and using your concepts and citing and using your work. How many citations you have, but also the broader idea of kind of intellectual leadership. If you suggest a concept, do other people pick it up, is really, really key to your kind of career success and progression over time. And it's how kind of prestige and respect and influence is built. So I think maybe there was a slight naivety that handing out, that parceling up this money in such ways without also demanding certain things in terms of, okay, well, what's your internal peer review or self-scrutiny or quality assurance going to look like? Or maybe that just wasn't on the agenda, but I think that, for example, is one of the concrete things that could be put back on the agenda, is within these centers, One, how are you going to make sure that you're not massively concentrating power in the hands of the PI? And two, how are you going to do internal quality assurance? And then I think there's also the question of who is able to successfully apply for these funds. And I think some of that, again, is quite contingent. So just reading, we're talking about it before the session, just reading a new paper that's come out by a team at King's College London, led by Alex Pollitt, looking at the costs of grant application and the costs of peer review. And they find that the costs for applying for a grant are about 13% of the value of the total funding for the grant, and they find that about 89% of those costs fall on the researcher themselves. And then that has really kind of gendered and racialized implications, because as these grants become more and more competitive and the chance of anyone being successful is vanishingly small, it really rewards people who are able to put in multiple applications and apply regularly. And yet what they find is that for minoritized scholars coming from underrepresented background, each grant application takes longer, often because they're more junior, or they're hired on more precarious contracts, or they have more disadvantageous teaching loads, or they're also fighting, I don't know, the Home Office for a visa because that keeps being called into question. There are all of these ways that sort of, if you're not that ideal academic who is effectively child-free or doesn't have to worry about kind of dependence and has a kind of secure visa status, there are all of these ways that if academic success relies on this like low chances of success but high input kind of bottleneck, then of course we're going to see these kind of inegalitarian outcomes. So the sorts of people who are actually kind of able to succeed in the system are kind of, representing those who are already very, very well represented in the system.
Okay, thank you, Portia, for summarizing that, and also signposting us to this new finding. I think it will be a very valuable contribution to the conversation. I think I would like to invite people to pop in, I don't know, to open their mic and raise questions. I recognize Peter, and I think some also.
Can I just realized I forgot a reference there. So just saying that a lot of that analysis of the inequalities in academic context comes from a 2020 paper called Equalities in Freefall, which is by Catherine Wright, Tony Harstrup, and Roberta Garina. So if you're looking for that sort of analysis, that's a really, really strong and compelling summary of it in that article.
Awesome. Thank you, Portia. So I'll give the floor to Peter, Taylor, and Famhiki, and perhaps after them, I will ask you, Portia, to respond to their questions. Peter, you have the floor.
Great, thanks. And thanks, Portia. Really interesting presentation and set of reflections. So, I mean, you've described injustices, which certainly do play out in the academic space. I think we've experienced them in many different ways, wherever we are. And as you've just said as well, these certainly are deeply rooted in wider power imbalances in the global research ecosystem. So in a collaboration now over several years with Southern Voice and IDS, we've recognized that there is really growing momentum around ideas like equitable partnerships. You could call it a buzzword or a fuzzword, whichever you like. And there's lots of principles and guidelines that should guide behavior. And we see many examples of, unfortunately, these not being followed. For example, the kinds of things that Portia's just been talking about. And the reasons for lack of action are really varied. As Portia just said, it could be the context of top-down or pyramidal structures and hierarchies, risk averseness, projectization, downloaded requirements from the funders, and many of those are definitely baked in from the start. So there are deep structural issues which then play out because it's really hard to shift the status quo. This is what's really emerging out of the work that we've been doing. So a key question that we're exploring is how to move towards practical action which can change current power asymmetries, because I think the problems you've described are really deeply rooted, really widespread, I think actually quite recognized, but it's really important to understand what this really looks like in practice, as you just shared. So central to our question of how to move towards action to change it, how do you build accountabilities that will actually drive change in mindsets and behaviors about research agendas, expected outcomes and impacts, questions, methods, analysis, dissemination, engagement, and so on? and what these look like in practice. Are there lessons from what you've observed from your experience or from the cases you've looked at, which indicate how these kinds of accountabilities can actually be built in to these kinds of mechanisms you've described, which will actually start to change practices and behaviors rather than just those remaining in the domain of aspirations to try to see things improve? I think there's a real desire to see it changing, but change is proving really intractable. So any thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. Sam, can you? Yes.
Thanks. Struggling. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. And thanks, Portia. Always follow your work and always learn a lot from it. So my question, I've got two questions, if I may. The first is, how much is this a bug of that model of funding, which I think you've rightly critiqued, and how much is it a feature of how particular centres get managed? It seems to me that we need a sort of research ecosystem that has multiple modalities, all of which are fully open globally in the ways that Peter has sort of started to set out, but which also operate at different scales. So we should have windows fully open and supported for individuals to do great N=1 type work. But I think we also need some of these larger funded research centres to advance knowledge around, to test theory at scale, to compare at scale across different areas. And I think there are other examples of research centres commissioned around the same time that have done a better job. So I'm just a bit concerned about, what's your reading of this? Is it specific to the way in which certain of these types of centres get managed, or are you making an argument against all hierarchical large research centres? So, because I think there's a baby in bathwater dilemma there. And then the second point is, I'm not sure I know you're aware of it because you mentioned the African Cities Research Centre, which was the last big centre that funded in this space, as you point out, but which have also undertaken significant efforts to decolonise their approach, decentralising resources and decision-making to city teams to make decisions about how they move forward. It definitely has its origins in exactly the type of problematic centre that you set out, and that's how the funding came. But thereafter, Diana Mitlin, with other colleagues, including African colleagues who sit on the senior leadership team with her, have taken significant steps to move in the direction that Peter's starting to outline. So I just wonder if there's other examples that we could draw on to learn from that might give us a somewhat different impression of how large funded research can go forward in more progressive ways, both for knowledge production and in terms of the equity issues that you and Eyob have raised. Thank you.
Okay. Portia, can you respond to both Peter and Sam's questions? Then I'll follow up.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, for really valuable interventions there and putting a lot on the table and clearly speaking from a lot of really, really rich experience. So on Peter's point of we've had a lot of recommendations over the years, like the Equitable Partnerships agenda was already well underway when the Global Challenges Research Fund was dispersing all of this money. And yet why are the problems and the inequalities so intractable? I think one of them, one response to that is to borrow a phrase from Naila Kabir's work on patriarchy, where she describes it as the endless monotony, but the infinite variation of patriarchy. And so I think one of those things is like where you have really overwhelming inequalities and forms of domination, et cetera, like we shouldn't be surprised that it's kind of a whack-a-mole. You try and resolve them in one way, and yet they're expressed through these other forms in these new settings. But I think part of it is also, and to borrow another concept from the Wright et al. 2020 reading, the Equalities in Freefall. So this Equitable Partnerships agenda and the decolonizing agenda is coming on stream when the precaritization of pretty much every single person in the academy is skyrocketing. So for example, whilst I was at LSE, starting as a PhD student and then leaving as a postdoc, all of the universities in the UK increased their their proportion of temporary staff versus permanent staff, LSE actually reduced its number of permanent staff over that time, and made up for it with an absolute increase in temporary staff as well. So there's a certain thing about these demands for equality are being made into a situation where I think the people who end up embodying that Western hegemony are actually very, very precariously and insecurely placed as kind of carriers of that hegemonic position. So again, borrowing from that Wright et al. Article, they use the phrase ontological insecurity. And they say that you kind of need this refers to the need to have a sense of yourself as a kind of whole and continuous person to have any agency. And I think that's so true. So if the people who are looking to enact some of this change have very, very short time horizons, and a lot of their energy is going on just trying to reproduce their position within academia, I think it's not that surprising that really erodes people's capacity to do that. And then in terms of what are some positive examples, I think so I can talk about the large grant funded research centres separately, but I think there is a way. So thinking about who are academics accountable to. So partly they're accountable to promotions criteria, which often don't include these. Or, I mean, if you're on a university management committee and you're setting those promotions criteria, put something on decolonizing and EDI into them. But where they're kind of hostile or unsupportive, I think we do have a choice about how we build epistemic communities that hold people accountable to these values and these practices in other ways. So I'm just thinking there's been a lot of work kind of over the last maybe 10 years, symbiotic building up of the Lagos Studies Association conference and the kind of community around that, and the African Studies Association UK conference, kind of trying to be more co-supportive between those two conferences. And I think between them, they are doing really key work on setting slightly new norms. And it's not always on decolonizing. A lot of what they've done is on the kind of supportiveness for junior scholars and trying to deconstruct the kind of overwhelming superior position of senior scholars. And really simple things, just like putting everyone's email addresses on the program and setting the norm being that, and anyone can approach you via email to ask about your paper. So it's not, I know it's not quite the same thing, but I think there are ways that people have agency to build in kind of wherever they are, slightly new norms of doing academic work. And then coming around to Sam's question, which I think partly responds to that call for kind of positive examples. So I think it's really worth looking at places like the African Cities Research Consortium that have tried to put these things into practice. So had the privilege of kind of working a bit with Edwin Arigi, who did a kind of internal report on decolonizing the African Cities Research Consortium. And a lot of that was designed kind of at point of conception to try and empower country teams to set the direction of research and to have really strong representation of kind of locally embedded scholars. But then maybe Sam's question is actually, but is there just something wrong with the amount of money being chunked up? And that actually you'd get better outcomes, or I guess the question is, am I saying you just get better outcomes if people weren't trying to manage 5, 6, 30 million pounds? So I think there is an argument for that. So I think partly there's this question of, you know, people are trained to do academic work and then suddenly they find themselves being managers of really complex organizational and financial entities. So that is one question. Then how many people really are going to be able to kind of manage that sort of responsibility? Who has a track record? You end up kind of reducing down to a pretty slim handful of people who can demonstrate that they are a safe bet to allocate all of that money to. I think there is a question around whether, what is it you're promising when you've got that amount of money? And I think maybe one of the errors was that importing from the kind of paradigm of hard sciences and medicine, there was this idea that there's going to be a really, really strong conceptual coherence or a single kind of big bang contribution made by these large grant funded research centers. And I think sometimes that works in medicine because it's like, well, let's just try this one vaccine candidate. It's going to take 30 million pounds. It's going to take a team of 200 researchers. Let's do it. But as I argue in the policy brief associated with this paper, I don't think that is how knowledge production or kind of conceptual innovation works well in the social sciences, especially in the sort of fieldwork based, engaged, kind of often kind of qualitatively orientated social sciences that we're doing in development studies. And so, but I know that's it's not to say that we don't want money, but I do think that, I mean, Ollie Owen did a presentation on his work with local kind of environmental and climate agents in Nigeria. And he said, you know, the ideal amount of money is £20,000, but no one wants to give that much. They all want to give more or less. So I think there is a discussion to be had there, and maybe then the applications wouldn't have to be so time consuming. Maybe people wouldn't have to promise as much in terms of that kind of ex ante lock-in of impact agenda. But yeah, I know that's that there might be views on that.
Let's move on. We have almost 18 minutes to go, and let's have more inputs. I recognize Matthew Benson.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I think I know many of you. I think, Portia, you've raised some really good points. I guess the one thing that I wanted to kind of highlight, having been someone, I guess it should say, has worked in CRP and now has worked in the peace rep. So, I mean, but I want to kind of challenge it a bit, because my own work and that of several of the colleagues has actually done exactly what you say doesn't happen. We've really been able to develop our own concepts and so forth. My own work on predatory peace, and I'm looking at civic fiscal resistance and fiscal state building in the Sudans and in the global South as a whole, and really actually challenging the overall paradigm that took shape. And I will say that this emerged through a lot of contestation, which you can imagine, and is very much captured in a lot of your work. Like, this was not, this was unexpected that it came from a quote unquote junior researcher, also a minoritized one. It's unexpected that it came from an African team within, at least that was the perception that myself and others who were working on these issues had. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, I don't want to speak for them, and I can't speak for them, but Naomi Pendle also did some really interesting work that's emerged, and Rachel Ebrick, my very close friend and colleague, Rajan Makawi, on the Sudan side, has had some incredible impact as well. There's multiple other examples, but I guess the thing that I want to highlight is that, in a way, perhaps through unintended ways in which the grant has worked, at least on the LSE side, there actually has been that pyramid structure where individuals who are early career researchers and minoritized, such as myself, have actually gone off in the woods and done our own thing, and used the money to our own advantage, to then actually critique the very subject of inquiry and provide a whole new lens, and in so doing, arguably have created some of the most impactful conceptual development that has emerged from it. And so a book with CUP, various articles, and all of this has all been peer-reviewed, I should also say, because I think your point of sort of that it isn't being peer-reviewed is not only is it peer-reviewed, but peer-reviewed in top journals. I think I want to make sure that that's also emphasized. So, but I think this has been something that's been a struggle. It hasn't been something that's necessarily, it emerged organically. It wasn't, I don't think people, when we started out, would have thought that this would have taken shape in the way that it did. So I'm wondering about ways in which those other stories can also be captured by what you've done, because it shows that it is possible to do it differently, and actually more support there would certainly be needed. And something that I would also argue is actually a real challenge, and the most real challenge I'm confronting, and those who others are confronting as the grant closes, is actually, well, where do you fit now that you've done this? Because you have this quite unusual career where you're not quite actually early career anymore. You've published in lots of different venues. You have an incredible policy impact. I mean, like, our impact side is just bananas, but like, that doesn't necessarily translate actually to the UK and even the American job market, which doesn't necessarily understand these things. So I think there's also a question of, well, where do we go? Because we're being trained in a particular mode. And I would say that the mentorship is not there. I would say that it's really kind of ambient at best, and that ambience can go both negative and positive. So there's a question, it really does rely upon highly entrepreneurial and dogged researchers to accomplish this. I mean, it's also the type of researcher who thrives in conflict environments to begin with. You have to be this way. But I do wonder about how that support could be provided, because it is something that we're kind of out there on a tightrope at the moment, just sort of figuring it out as we go. And that really shouldn't be the case, because arguably we're some of the best and brightest researchers emerging, and yet it's not clear we really know where we're going to go. And so I do wonder what your thoughts on that may be. But thank you otherwise for raising these good points. And I've seen this develop over the years, but I did want to kind of throw that in there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. That's very, very useful and relevant intervention. There's a question from, I can only pronounce the last name, Kumalo, properly rather than the first name. I really apologize. Would you like to ask the question by yourself, or do you want me to read? I don't know whether you are in a position not to do it. Okay, let me do. Thank you, Portia. Maybe the question of impact needs to be extended to decolonizing methodology, i.e. data sources collection and analysis. Large funded research has to be reoriented toward this. Why chambers called last first, so that knowledge production centers the researched and is not just about quick, neat, and compliant output. I think this is a relevant question where my question would also be, my concern, I think, would also somehow revolve around this. And also as a contribution to both what Sam and Peter said as well. I think there is a substantive misalignment between academic research, the process that it requires for concept generation or rigorousness, and the policy domain, where things are expected to be too quick and a little bit faster than the academic process. And if we are just always responding to the pace set by the policy domain and the impact agenda, I think we will always miss the bigger picture. And I think that's where one of my critique about the equitable partnership framework. It's quite easy to appease and satisfy this quick focus on the policy domain without going deeper into the structural epistemic issues that contribute to the substantive features of inequality. So I think this aspect of knowledge production that always tries to match the pace of the policy domain by producing high impact policy output might be one area where the substantive misalignment is well situated. And I think this concern is somehow shared by what Khumalo is also sharing here. What's your response on this, Portia? Please be brief as much as possible so that we have at least the last round.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, again, thanks so much to Matt and Dr. Khumalo as well for their contributions on that. And it may be that actually at this point there's more knowledge among the kind of audience and Q&A than me and Eyob ourselves have to share. I guess, yeah, this is, I mean, Matt, your point about CRP and peace rep is absolutely spot on. So like some really, really fantastic research came out of it, and also some really fantastic networks and kind of new ways of operating as well. And a lot of that was driven by a kind of cohort of junior scholars who've done great work. And it's true, and I note in the paper that actually in terms of the kind of academic output, so those peer-reviewed journal articles that come out of CRP, actually the PI's concept, this idea of the political marketplace is not central in it, and it appears very infrequently. But I think what I've seen in the way that this kind of class of very senior PIs is able to kind of knit together from one large grant funded research center to another. So CRP comes on the back of the, is it JSRP, Justice and Security? There is this kind of phenomenon of being able to build up what looks to the outside like an incredibly deep body of work on a concept. And yet then when you trace the citations, a lot of them are self-referential, and a lot of them are done by junior scholars working for the PI. So then having a look at the way that political marketplace is now being applied to questions of transition and climate. And I guess my concern is that it potentially gives the impression of a form of kind of that this has been academically validated in a way that perhaps it hasn't, in terms of kind of broad-based, multi-actor, organically generated evidence and research. And then I was thinking about like this question of why is there something about working, Western institutions working on the African context that means that we have to be especially rigorous in terms of our use of concepts? And because there is this other argument of like, well, these rarefied academic procedures like peer review and journals, they're totally dysfunctional in themselves. Shouldn't we just be trying to get the work out as quickly as possible? But I think the context of kind of Western-based institutions working on Africa, they're operating in a space of almost like relentless magnetic power of a set of kind of underlying stylized stories about how Africa operates. And in that situation, if you're brief and breezy and kind of impressionistic about your claims of how you think the world operates and how you think African politics operates, then there's this risk that I think we see play out again and again, where actually it just the same story is, oh, okay, you're saying they it's a bit like a marketplace, and then we just see, what was called neo-patrimonialism, what was called kind of big manism before that. And I think it's that there's, when you're operating around such a hegemonic set of understandings, that's when you need to be really precise and say, here are the claims that we have in the literature. This is how we currently understand it. And what we think is wrong, or what we think we need to do differently, or what we want to problematize is X, Y, Z, and be really actually quite precise about that. So maybe there is a kind of additional need within this kind of Western dominated knowledge of Africa to actually hold ourselves to like higher standards of conceptual rigor, because that storytelling function is so influential.
Yeah, I think Thandika has done a massively significant job in that piece on world politics about neo-patrimonialism, how it has become almost like a catch-all phrase to explain almost everything. And that's why I think we should be much more concerned about the systemic structure, the systemic enabling environment that has created the space to come up with this kind of, where these kinds of practices are even celebrated and become much more an aspect of huge achievements and success. And unless we give more time for this critical reflection, if we quickly jump into then how can we translate it into action, these critical reflections, I think, need to be well understood, well explained, and elaborated in multiple shape or form, so that we will not just simply praise, decentralized decision-making system, diversified researchers, or new ways of communication as big win, so that we get distracted from the bigger picture. Yes, there are some change and progress happening, but the bigger picture, I think, remains still hanging. Peter, I see your contribution here. Perhaps if we can have some final word from, I don't know, from you or Indrajit before Portia give her comments.
Well, no, thanks. I can say something really quickly. Just in the chat, I was just, and I'd love to hear Indrajit's comments as well. I think one of the challenges is that we do work within an academic system that basically privileges hierarchies. I mean, people move through that by achieving certain academic milestones, PhDs, further qualifications, publications. And unfortunately, that creates a system, as we know well, that behavior can take place with impunity. It's really difficult to challenge different kinds of behaviors within a system which builds itself around authority and hierarchy. So I think however we think about the location of these kinds of structures, the fact that they're deeply embedded and perpetuated by the academic system is something which is really hard to change. And I love the comment that Silanganiso mentioned, about referring Robert Chambers' work about putting the last first. And I think there's a lot to learn about inclusion through, for example, participatory research, action-oriented research, community-based research, which can really help to challenge some of the inherent structures that we see deeply embedded in academia. Thanks.
Yeah. Indrajit.
Yeah,
please.
thanks. Thank you so much. Portia, I really enjoyed listening to the conversation, as well as, of course, reading the paper, and learned a lot from the questions. I thought it really is very useful to think about the ways in which large centers or academia more broadly seems to be privileging a sort of not just hierarchy, but also inequality when you think about concentration of resources. it's, I suppose, in that sense, a microcosm of the wider world, right? There's just more resources being concentrated in fewer hands. This doesn't mean that those who control those resources are necessarily bad people or bad individuals or even bad centers or institutions, but it does, I think, get us to reflect on the tendency towards concentrating resources. That said, I'm also wary of privileging, and I'm not saying you're doing that, but I think there is a certain tendency among a lot of us to say, well, peer-reviewed articles are, peer-reviewed publications need to be safeguarded. They need to be protected because that's how academic knowledge goes forward. I'm, of course, and you've picked it up as well in your contributions. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, and it may well be the point that large grant centers do have the ability to challenge existing forms of hierarchies that all of us are care deeply about. And I guess I think your paper as well as the responses to the questions are a provocation to think about how those centers may be used or should be used perhaps to challenge quite problematic hierarchies that are entrenched. I think I'm not saying that we have to accept them because they exist, etc. I'm not suggesting that at all. But how can we best make use of a situation that's come to be in order to push forward work that does privilege and prioritize voices that have been marginalized? And it may be the case that large grant centers could be used thanks to the pressure that articles like yours will put on them to challenge existing hierarchies. Of course, then we have the problem of creating new hierarchies, but that's, I guess, a constant tussle or dialectic, as some of my colleagues would like to call it. But I'll stop there. It wasn't really a question, but I thought I should say something because of how much your article got me to think about these things.
Great, thank you, Indrajit. Portia, I will give you exactly 1 minute just to say whatever you want to say as a final word. Then I will close just by thanking and giving some quick information to the participants. Portia, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, so I just wanted to end. There's a statistic that you raised with your co-authors in that Beyond Tinkering article from 2023, where you kind of argue for the charter that you guys devised for doing research in Africa, and you point out that in Africa, 70 to 85% of publications are based on international collaborations, versus in Europe, OECD, Latin America, the number's more like 35 to 45%. So I think that hugely extroverted nature of African knowledge production that we keep seeing is the reason why this sort of stuff that can sometimes feel like you're just talking about the kind of minutiae of how British people in British institutions spend British money kind of speaking to British journals. Actually, what happens in these kind of what would be called like core nodes in the kind of global knowledge production system really matters, because there's still such a dominance and such a kind of piggybacking on these structures. So I think sometimes it can sound a bit navel gazing, but I think it's still worth kind of really trying to name and get beyond these things. Yeah, thanks so much for convening the space and the contributions and from Indrajit as well.
Yeah, great. Definitely. The dominance of international research collaborations can be, of course, a burden. I think it can also be the leverage point where we can do some things differently. And that's the kind of argument that we try to put forward in formulating the Africa Charter for Transformative Research Collaborations. Thank you, everyone, for giving us the time to join us having this conversation about large grant-funded research centers, promises, pitfalls, and power asymmetries. I think we had a very lively conversation. I really would like to thank the comms team at the Development Studies Association, especially Rowena, and everyone who has contributed to it. For those of you who would like to be part of this such kind of conversation, I'm sharing a link on the chat. We have a Decolonizing Development Directory where we try to create a network of scholars interested in this such kinds of debates, where we can create a space to engage much more fruitfully, frequently within both the essay and also within the conference activities and between conferences. So please check that out. If you want, please register and we'll reach out to you through our activities. I thank my fellow conveners of the subgroup at the DSA Council, Professor Peter Taylor and Professor Indrajit Roy. And I thank everyone for your time. Thanks more specifically for you, Portia, for bringing us this lively topic for discussion. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me. Thanks to the audience.
Have a great day. Okay.
And thanks, Eyob, for stepping